One of the most interesting developments in the whole city of Belfast was actually a force development, and people talk about the developments that occurred throughout the 50s, 60s and 70s, but the main major development was actually in 1941, and it was a force development in the fact that it was 200 German planes that flew to Belfast to bomb it, and this resulted in a lot of deaths, it resulted in a lot of destruction, and therefore in future years it resulted in a lot of development. Now, at the time of just at the outbreak of the Second World War, 1939, people believed that, the Germans could never reach Belfast and that their planes would never be able to come as far north as Belfast. And in a way they were right, because from any German position, they couldn't have reached here, they just ran out of fuel. But what an unforeseen circumstance was the actual invasion of France. And once this occurred, it meant that you had German bases in the north of France, which meant that they could have reached any target in Britain and Ireland, and that's exactly what they'd done. Now in Belfast they had the air raid precautions and they had air raid wardens, and unfortunately at the time the citizens laughed at them, they thought it was all a joke, and when they had blackout restrictions nobody really bothered with it and nobody really listened to them. Now, whenever the invasion of France did occur, the Germans set up an airbase at Brittany, and it was from there that they launched their first attack in Belfast. But we'll have to look at why they targeted Belfast. There's a lot of people think it was symbolic, but it wasn't. Belfast was a prime target for the Luftwaffe and for the German army, because it made a lot of munitions, it made a lot of uniforms, parachutes, everything that an army could need in a war, and a lot of it was made in Belfast. So whenever they came to Belfast, because of the distance they were travelling, what they wanted to do was they wanted to make sure that they didn't just go over and carpet bomb the city. They wanted to make sure that they got their targets, and when their first raid occurred, that's exactly what they done. Now, the first raid that the Germans carried out was on the 7th of April 1941. And what it was, it became known as the dockside raid, because that's precisely what it was. And what they done was they targeted the docks, which are directly behind me here. And the docks was an obvious target because of shipbuilding. And this is where the aircraft were built for Shorts. The warships were built at Harland and Wolff, and where a lot of munitions were also prepared as well. So whenever the Germans came, they knew exactly where the docks were. And they had target plans. They didn't just come over, look out the window and try and imagine where the docks could have been situated. They knew exactly and precisely where they were. So whenever they started bombing, the Harland and Wolff shipyard at that time, the whole fuselage factory, it was 4.5 acres and it was completely destroyed. And there's a lot of propaganda came out afterwards, that they thought the waterworks in the Antrim Road were the docks and stuff like this. But whenever they came, in terms of military precision, it was precise, and they basically destroyed the docks. As I was saying, there's a lot of stuff that occurred after the war. There's people, we associate the bombings of London, Coventry, Southampton, Liverpool. But whenever they came to Belfast, it really was a hit and run exercise. And for this first hit and run, they came, they wanted to bomb the docks, and when they went, that's exactly what they had just achieved. The next time the Germans returned to Belfast to bomb it was on what came known as the Easter Tuesday raid, and that occurred on the 15th of April 1941. And it was one of the biggest raids because it basically went on for hours. Now, whenever I certainly can't remember, but whenever people look back at the Blitz, they think that this must have been a great big adventure and how exciting it all must have been. But I mean, you try and imagine 200 planes, which consisted of Junkers and Henkels, and just came and bombed Belfast. Now, whenever people think back about the Blitz and even research the Blitz, they think that it must have been an exciting time and it must have been, a big adventure really. But try and imagine the absolute terror that must have been going on, because here we had these 200 bombers, heavy, quite heavy bombers, flying round and round Belfast, dropping absolute tons of bombs, and nobody knowing where these things are going to land. And it must have been absolutely terrifying. The other thing that we think is, the Germans had this policy of what was known as blitzkrieg, or lightning war. People think that whenever the Germans attacked, it was very, very quickly. But this bombing in Belfast went on for hours. And if you can imagine sitting in your house, or sitting in an air raid shelter, or sitting anywhere, and these bombs going off around you left, right and centre, it must have been horrifying. Now, whenever they bombed the Belfast city centre, they had quite a few targets, and one of them was the City Hall. Now, the City Hall wasn't a prime military target. It was basically symbolic. I think basically what the Germans were trying to say is, we hit your City Hall, we can hit anywhere. Another target which I never work out why they missed it, because it was quite a distinctive area, and that was the gasworks which stood on the Armour Road, and which was one of the targets which was meant to be hit on this raid. But they never did. They never went near the gasworks, and South Belfast got off relatively late, and it's just a mystery as to why they didn't hit the gasworks, because once again they had target maps, they knew exactly where it was, and they didn't really need to look out and see it. Another myth that we had from a Blitz 2 was that they used buildings as a guide to see where they were going, one of them being the twin spires of St Peter's on the Falls Road. This is absolute rubbish, because the planes that they were using, they had pathfinders, and once the pathfinders had worked out where the targets were, all they had to do was just fly after them, fly exactly where they left the coordinates, and just drop the bombs. They didn't even have to see where the bombs were landing. They knew precisely where everything was. Now, the two areas that got the heaviest bombing on this occasion was East Belfast and North Belfast. East Belfast, obviously, because once again the shipyard was a target, and North Belfast because of the mills and all the different places that were making munitions. Now, another myth that came up was the bombing of Victoria Barracks. Victoria Barracks at this time was the largest military base in the north, and there were stories circulated that they never hit, not one bomb landed in Victoria Barracks. But the fact of the matter is, Victoria Barracks was levelled. It was completely destroyed, and hundreds upon hundreds of soldiers, mostly women, were all killed. Another target in the north of the city was the waterworks on the Antrim Road, which, as the name suggests at that time, supplied Belfast with its water. And the Germans bombed it, but quite deliberately. There's another myth, once again, that they thought that was the docks, but that's nonsense. They bombed it with the intention of wiping out the city's water supply. And the reason for that was for one of their next raids, when they came over and bombed Belfast with fire. This raid here, this was one of the biggest ones, and I pointed out, it must have been really terrifying for the citizens of the city. But in this raid, most of the area directly behind me and around me was completely destroyed, and we have archive photographs showing, the exact destruction that must have been caused. But the only thing I would like to emphasise is, forget about the buildings. Just try and imagine what it must have been like for our grandparents and our great-grandparents, because it must have been a horrible time for everyone. Another aspect to the Easter Tuesday raid that was different on this raid was that Belfast was not the only target. And what the Germans had decided to do was that while they were coming to Belfast, they would also hit other targets. And they would fly in a circular fashion. And they would go for other cities in the UK. The main ones being Liverpool, Manchester, and London and Coventry on the way back. So they would fly in this semicircle mode and hit Belfast first, swing round to the right, hit a couple of British cities, and then return to their base in France. Now, on this occasion, there was 180 bombers involved, and I mentioned about the destruction caused and the deaths, and it was the written accounts that we have of the time are absolutely horrific. You had bodies lying on the streets, the houses were blown to bits, and bits and pieces of dead people were found all over the place. horrific examples of arms being found here and legs being found there. And people in Belfast at the time were very, very brave about this. You know, they all came together, they muscled in, and they helped to clear up. But other people who should have known better were, let's just say, not so brave, in the sense of, you know, some soldiers were just running in terror. Some of the air raid wardens were also running in terror. And one of the most disturbing was the head of the Belfast Fire Brigade, a man named John Smith. He was actually found underneath his desk, weeping and crying bitterly and refusing to come out. You know, but when we look back and we call these people cowards, do we really have the right to do that? Because, as I mentioned, it was a terrifying time, and with all these bombs going on, you have to ask yourself seriously, you know, on that occasion, what exactly would you have done yourself? And as I say, whenever you have all these accounts of the bodies being picked up and taken to places like St George's Market and the Falls Road Baths, and just laid together, you know, it must have been absolutely dreadful and must have been horrific. Now, on this raid, what happened was, altogether there was 203 metric tons of bombs were dropped, and there were 6,000 fire bombs dropped. And as I mentioned, this was one of the biggest raids, and for the citizens of Belfast, you know, it was a real horrible, horrible time. But unfortunately for them, a hell of a lot worse was yet to come. Now, as I'd mentioned, the Easter Tuesday raid was the biggest in Belfast so far. And, you know, there was a more terrifying raid to come, because the Germans had actually planned for this return raid. And when I mentioned about the waterworks in the Antrim Road being a target, this was the purpose of it. It was for this return raid. Because once they destroyed the water supply, the British, the authorities knew then that what they had planned to do. And throughout the city, we had seen water basins being built where the bomb sites were. We'd seen hoses being laid down the centre of the streets. And basically what they knew was that the Germans were going to return for a fire raid. And on the 4th of May 1941, that's exactly what they'd done. And this raid, the final one on Belfast, did become known as the fire raid. Once again, it went on for hours, and once again, if you can imagine, this time the horror must have been really unbearable, because the German plan was to create a firestorm. And the way they done this was they flew in a circular motion, dropping fire bombs, with the idea being that the fire would suck up the oxygen and burn everything in its path and basically suffocate the population to death. Now, what they really had done was they had flew over once again with their bombers, and on this occasion they dropped 237 tons of high explosives. But on top of that, they dropped 95,992 incendiary bombs. And as I said, the whole purpose was to create this massive firestorm which would have just burnt Belfast to the ground. Now, whenever they were doing this, because they weren't going for a specific target, there was no risk to the German planes whatsoever, because they flew at 8,000 feet and well beyond the reach of any anti-aircraft gun. And even at the city at the time, for whenever they needed to do that, the city was so poorly defended that some of the German planes actually even flew below the balloon barrages, which were set up to wipe out the planes. And, you know, we all have these stories and myths that Belfast put up a tremendous fight. But that leaves us with the question, what did they fight with? There was nothing here. There was only a couple of anti-air raid guns, and they were useless because, as I say, the Germans on this occasion were flying so high. Now, the terror of all the Blitz, but I mean, the terror of this one was beyond belief. And this is the thing, that whenever we look back at the Blitz, we need to remember just exactly what our forebears must have went through. And fortunately, there was a lot of people kept, you know, diaries and wrote notes of what did occur. And we're fortunate to have these today. And one of the quotes, for example, was, on the Crumlin Road there was army lilies, and they were piled high with corpses and severed limbs. And many of the dead were brought to the Falls Road Baths, and many more are raised to the pool to be drained, to lay out 150 corpses. And one of the attendants there remembered one coffin containing a young mother with her 2 dead children, one on each arm. Now, for us to try and contemplate what that must have been like, it must have been horrible, because This was only one example of one dead person, and there was nearly 1,000. So it must have been real horrific stories from all around. Another one was 250 corpses were let out in St George's Market, and a nurse at the time who worked in the battlefields during the First World War had stated the following: "I have seen death in many forms, young men dying of ghastly wounds during the First World War, but while death in hospital beds in France had been solemn, tragic and dignified, here it was grotesque, repulsive and horrible." And to be honest with you, I think that says it all about the Belfast Blitz. Now, as I say, this fire raid was the last bombing on Belfast, and the war continued on for another few years up until May 1945. And when we think about our city and think about the bombing that was done, we actually got off very late. As I said, it was just under 1,000 people killed. But try and imagine what it must have been like in London or even Coventry. And come to the close of the war, what it must have been like for the people of Leningrad in Russia and Stalingrad, because that's where the real horrors of the war really occurred. And then we have to think also about the German people. Now, not the Nazi regime, the normal German people, because whenever Berlin was bombed, there was thousands upon thousands killed. And then we also have the tragic tales of Dresden, the bombing of Dresden, where it was a pointless bombing really, and was aimed directly at the civilian population. So I mean, whenever we look at all these other cities, Leningrad, Stalingrad, Berlin, London, Coventry, Belfast actually got off quite late. To any visitor to Belfast city centre, one of the interesting things to do is when they're walking in Royal Avenue, High Street, Bridge Street, North Street, Waring Street, it's just to take a look at all the modern buildings and all the developments that are taking place, because a lot of those buildings were actually built on the Blitz sites. The area in High Street was known as Blitz Square for many years, and whenever we look at all these modern 60s buildings, this is where all this bombing took place. And one of the more notable would be the College Yard on York Street. It was built on Blitz sites as well, and the area around St Anne's Cathedral, it was all levelled and totally destroyed. But I'd mentioned briefly about the bombings in other cities, in Russia and Germany and Britain. And one of the interesting aspects of the Irish dimension is that Belfast was not the last Irish bombing raid. And the one it was actually in another country, so to speak, if you want to put it that way, and it was the bombing of Dublin. Now, the Irish Republic, or the Irish Free State then, it was a neutral country, and a lot of people were baffled as to why the Germans had decided to bomb Dublin. And the reason was quite simple. As I mentioned, it was neutral, so for both sides they were meant to stay out of the war. But whenever they bombed Belfast, because De Valera's government had recognised Northern Ireland as being part of Ireland, and part of the Irish Republic, and so to come, they also seen it as a bombing on one of their cities. And what they done is they sent the fire brigade up to help in the fire, put out the fires during the fire blitz. And the fire brigade came from Dublin, Drogheda, Dundalk, and all our border counties, and came up north to help. Now, the Germans weren't too happy about this, because the way they were looking at it was they seen it as they were assisting the British administration. And there was quite a few other aspects of it as well, because whenever German planes crashed in the Free State, the captured German pilots were held as POWs. But whenever British planes crashed, the British pilots were helped and assisted back to England. So, as I said, the Germans weren't too happy about all this, and they decided that the Irish government had to be given a warning. And so that's why they decided to bomb Dublin. And it wasn't a major bomb, and it was nowhere near like what Belfast got. I think it was just over 30 people killed. But what the idea was to say to them, look, this is our war between Germany and Britain. If you want to become involved, this is what we're going to do. And that was the last assistance that the Irish government gave the British. And as I say, whenever we know about the Blitz in Belfast, the actual last Irish bombing occurred in Dublin on the 30th of May 1941. And fortunately for the rest of us, that was the last German plane, well, the last German bomber plane that was ever to fly over any part of Ireland.